Okay, welcome back. So it's worth thinking about what we want our blog class to do. So leaving this away, leaving that out, see what would we want to be able to do with our blog. So I think being able to do something like blog equals blog, and then giving it, say, the author equals Jose, the title of the blog equals sample title, or any other title that we want, a description probably, and that's probably enough, I'd guess, for a blog. And then be able to say blog.newPost. That would be what I would want to be able to do with a blog, and then probably save to Mongo, probably be able to do something like blog from Mongo as well. So these are the sort of things that I would probably be wanting to be able to do with a blog. So it's going to have an author, title, description, and a few actions that it can do. Create a new post, save itself to Mongo, get a new one from Mongo. Maybe blog.getPosts. This is equivalent to post from blog ID. So a few things that would be interesting to be able to do. So let's go into our models, create a new Python file, call it blog, and then let's start making our blog class here. So def init is going to be our first method, and it's going to have, as we decided, author, title, and description. And is it going to have any variables that are default, that have default values? So probably yes. It's probably going to have an ID that is going to default to none, and then it's going to get generated just like the post one. And it is also probably going to have a list of posts that it contains. I'm not entirely sure on this one, so we're going to leave it out for now and see if we do end up needing it or not. So we're just going to put these things in. And then self ID equals UUID UID4.hex if ID is none, else ID. Just like the post one, we'll have to import UID again, of course. Okay, and then let's have a look at the other methods. New post, save to Mongo, from Mongo, and get posts. New post. Pass, remember, is just do nothing for now. Get posts. Save to Mongo. And the save to Mongo is probably going to use a JSON method as we created for the post, same thing, and then get from Mongo. And in fact, in order to do this, I'm also going to introduce a new thing, which is not a static method or an instance method. It is a class method, and we're going to introduce that in just a few moments. The new post method, what it should do is it should ask the user to write the new post. So we're going to use the input method that we looked at in the first section. Content equals input, enter new, enter post content, and title equals input, enter post title. And then we're going to say date equals input, enter post date, or leave blank for today. And then we're going to say post equals post self.id. This is the blog ID. And remember, self.id, we're currently inside a blog object when we talk about self.id and not in a post object. So self.id would be the ID of the blog that this post is being created in. And then the other variables would be title, content, author. Title equals title, content equals content, date equals date, and that's it. The other two the other one is not really necessary, the ID. It gets generated automatically, and we'll have to import this post. And then we see blog ID, title, content, author, and I forgot that one. Author equals self.author. Remember, self.author, the author of the blog, is also the author of the post that he or she is writing. Now, one thing to remember is the date here in the post is a datetime object. Here, when we're writing it in, it will be a string. So we need a way to be able to parse the thing that the user is writing and then be able to convert that into a datetime object. So an option is to say in format DTMMYY. So we say, please write in format like 06/10/1990, for example. And that would then allow us to format the date properly. And in order to do that, we would say import datetime here at the top. And instead of date equals date, it would be datetime strp time date dmy. Okay, so this may be a bit confusing, but let me explain exactly what this does. Datetime module contains a class called datetime, and this class contains a number of methods to deal with dates. One of those methods is the strp time method, which is the string parse time. And what that does is it allows us to give it a string, which is the dates that the user has entered, and then it allows us to give it a format string. So the %d, %m, %Y says that we're expecting 2 digits for the day, 2 digits for the month, and 4 digits for the year. So in that case, we would have to tell the user to give us 4 Ys up there as well. Okay, and that would allow us to parse the date time there. And now we've created this post, but of course we have to save it to MongoDB. And there we are. Now we've got the new post already written. The getPosts method, what it will do is essentially the same as the fromBlog method here earlier. So what it will call is post.fromBlog self.id, and then it would return that. And that would simply get all of the posts that have the current blog's ID as an ID. The save to Mongo, we can simply go back to the post and get this save to Mongo and copy that. Instead of posts, now it's going to be blogs as the collection, and import the database as well. And then the self.json is also going to be a Python dictionary that has the author, title, description, and ID. So author, self-author, title, self-title, description, self-description, ID, self.id. And that is everything that we need to save in MongoDB there. Finally, the get from Mongo will also be fairly simple. Blog data is going to be database.find1, collection equals blogs, as we know, and query equals ID is self.id. Of course, when we're getting a blog from Mongo, we're not going to have access to self, because we're going to get the blog in order to be able to create an object. We're not going to have the object already created. So we're not going to have access to self, which means we have to remove that, remove self, and instead pass the ID that we're looking for as a parameter here. However, Python now expects self to be there, so we have to say static method. The problem with static method is that now the only thing we can do is return blog data. And blog data may be what we want to return. It will return essentially an author, a title, a description, and an ID. However, the blog data is only this. We won't be able to call getPosts on the blog data. So what we want to do instead is return an object of type blog instead of just the data. So what we want to do is create a blog with this blog data. So what we'll do is we'll say author, title, description, and ID. Author equals author. Well, blog data author. Title equals blog data title. Description equals blog data description. And ID equals blog data ID. Okay, so what this will do is it'll say this author is equal to blog data author, and so on, until we return an object of type blog. And now on this object we could do get from Mongo, get posts, new posts, etc. So this is kind of makes sense, but there is a way in which we can simplify this substantially. If instead of static method we use class method, now Python will expect CLS to be there at the front, and this CLS, what it is blog. It's exactly the same thing, so we can essentially substitute one for the other. So no big changes there. So CLS returns the current class, and that is essentially used so that if we change the class name later on, we don't have to go to this method and change the class name there as well. Simplifies things, reduces the work needing to be done later on. So we could go to our post and do the same thing when we do from Mongo. Instead of returning the post data, what we could return is an object of type post. So add class method, CLS there, and then say CLS, well, post data equals, and then return CLS of the post data. Blog ID equals post data blog ID. Title equals post data title, and so on. There you go. This would be how we would be doing it in this case. So it does seem a bit more cumbersome to do this, but do remember that now we don't end up with some data being returned. Instead, we end up with an object being returned. So we can get from Mongo and then do something like change one of the properties, save it to Mongo again very easily. And with a blog, we can get the object back and then get the posts from it very easily. We don't need to perform multiple queries. We don't need to get the data and then call the post.get from blog method or things like that. So this simplifies the flow a bit. And this is the whole point where we've got objects, is to be able to use them. So this is the class method, and this is our blog class as well. So now we're going to be, in the next video, looking at whether this all works and how we can use it. And then finally, we'll move on to our user menu, where we're going to be interacting with the user. So I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so let's have a look at the app.py file, see if we can use these methods that we just created for the blog. The first thing to do would be to import blog, and we can stop importing posts just for now. And then we're creating a new blog. We're then writing the new post, which will ask us to enter the post details and save the post to MongoDB. We'll save the blog itself to MongoDB, and then we're going to, from database, we're going to get a blog from MongoDB, and the ID of the blog is going to be blog.id. This is a blog object here. This is because the ID gets generated, so we don't really want to be looking for it in the database and then copying and all that stuff. And then what we'll do is print blog.getPosts. And indeed, the method that we wrote for the blog is get from Mongo, which is different from the post method, which was called from Mongo. So let's rename it to from Mongo, and that way both have the same sort of convention for naming. Okay, let's press play and see what happens. The first thing that it does is it asks me for a post title, which is this new post line there. So my sample title for a post. And I add post content. This is a great day. Good luck with programming. Enter post date or leave blank for today. So leave blank for today, we didn't really program anything in for that, so that won't work. But the date, month, year could work. So let's try it out and see what happens. So 10 of 05 of 2015. And then indeed here you can see that wrote the post down. And the date time that was used was 2015, 5 for the month, 10 for the day, 00 for the date, for the times, because we didn't specify a time. And indeed that seems to have worked. So this is coming from the database, which is fantastic. Let's try to put in the leave blank for today, because that is what we told the user that could happen. So if they do leave it blank, what will happen is that it will fail. So let's go to our blog and then add something in there for the leave blank. So if date equals empty, then date is datetime dot UTC now, which would be the default value for the date. Remember that, however, if we do pass a date here, such as none, and then if we pass none there, then the post will fail to initialize because, or rather will be initialized with the date of none. So we want the date to be UTC now if it is blank, which is the current date. Okay, so let's try that again and see if that works. Sample post, sample content, and then I'm going to leave the date blank, and then that fails because of this. So now what it's doing is, if the date is empty, then it's setting the date to be UTC now, excellent, but then it is still trying to parse the date even though it does not need parsing. So what we'll do is else date equals that, and then date equals date. So what this does is, if the date is empty, then it sets it to be UTC now, and if it is not empty, then it sets it to be the parsed date, and then we pass that over to our initialize method. Let's play that again. And now we see that worked, and the date is indeed today's date, 20th of September. Do notice that when we do UTC now, the time also gets passed in, but that's not really a big problem. I think that is reasonable. If we are saying that we wrote this post in the past, we probably don't remember the exact time at which we wrote it, but if we are writing it today, then the time right now does make sense to include it. But anyway, that's up to you really to decide whether you want to include the date or not. If you do want to include times in the parsed string, you'll have to ask the user for a time as well. And you'll also have to investigate the strptime method to see how you can parse those times as well. It's really fairly simple, so I would not worry too much about it. You can go and look it up if you are interested, and I definitely recommend that you do if you want to just learn something a bit on the side there. It's quite simple to do. Okay, so this is how we would modify the new post in order to allow for blank dates, which would default to today. And we can see that the blog methods are indeed working. So in the next video, we're going to be working on the user menu that will allow them to open up their blog and things like that. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. Let's work on the menu that the users are going to see. So the first thing to do is leave our models and instead go into the project and create a new Python file, which we're going to call menu. And then create your class menu, which extends from object. And here it's going to have an init method, which is going to do something, and we're going to look at exactly what it's going to do in a moment. And then it's also going to have a method called run menu. And run menu is going to do essentially all that we would expect a menu to do. Give the user a choice to read blogs or to write blogs, and then allow the user to create their own blog or create their own account, things like that. So let's quickly create a flow of what this menu is going to do. User read or write blogs. So that's the question we're going to ask the user. Do you want to read or write a blog? If read, we're going to say list blogs in database. Allow user to pick one. Display blogs, display posts rather, and then that's it. So, and after that, we would go back to the beginning and ask them if they want to read more or write some more. So if write, check if user has a blog. If they do, prompt to write a post. If not, prompt to create a new blog, and that's it. The init method is going to ask user for author name, check if they've already got an account. If not, prompt them to create one. Okay, so these are the flows of the things that are going to happen in these two methods. They are obviously going to be calling other methods to do things like check if the user has a blog, allow the user to create an account, and things like that. So first thing, allow the user to enter their username, their author name. We're going to say self.user equals input, enter your author name. So that is going to allow them to enter their author name and put it inside the self.user variable. And then check if they've already got an account. If self user has account, then we're going to print welcome back, format self.user, else self prompt user for account. Okay, so a couple of new things in here, obviously. An underscore before a method. What does that mean? Does it mean anything? And the answer is quite simply, for Python, it does not mean anything. That's just a normal method, and that's it. However, for us, the developers, an underscore before the method name means that this is a private method, which means that only this class, only the menu class, should be calling these methods. We could call them from the app.py file, for example, but what the underscore in front of the method means is we should not do that because these methods are only to be used by the menu class. So preferably don't call them from anywhere else. That's what the underscore means. But again, it doesn't enforce anything. For Python, underscore before and no underscore before means exactly the same. It is just for us, the user. This is a convention that Python developers use to mean a private method that should only be accessed within the class. So let's create these two methods and see what happens with them. So def user has account and def prompt user for account. The user has account method, the only thing it has to do is check the blogs and see if there is any blog already created with a specific author. So database.find1 blogs, and then say author is self-user. This would find one blog that has the author as the user that the user has entered. So if this is not none, means we found one, which means there is a blog with that author, which means the user already has an account. So we would return this. Database.find1 with this author is not none. This would return either true or false because it would be checking whether what we find in the database is none or not. So it would return true or false. It would not return any data except that. Prompt user for account is essentially the same as start a blog. So the start a blog method would be something like enter the title, input, enter blog title, description equals input, enter blog description, and then say blog equals blog. We need to import this, and then say author, title, and description. Self.user, title, description. So author equals author user, title equals title, description equals description. And then we can say blog.save to Mongo, and that's it. So now the user has an account, we can proceed into writing. Okay, so let's have a look at the run menu method. We first ask the user if they want to read or write. So read or write is input. Do you want to read R or write W blogs? And then if read or write equals R, do something. Elif read or write equals write, do something else. Else, basically exit, print, thank you for reading, thank you for blogging, rather. Remember, we will have to put the pass in here. So what this does is ask the user whether they want to read or write. If they want to read, then we're going to list the blogs in the database and allow the user to pick one blog, display the post for that blog. If they want to write, we're going to check if they've already got a blog. We won't need to do this because we've already checked before. So if they have a blog, prompt them to write a post. If not, prompt them to create a new blog. They've already created a blog. That's why they've got a user account. We did that in the init method. So prompt them to write a post. And that's it. When they write a post, this post will need a blog ID to be associated to. So we're going to need to store this blog somewhere. So I'm going to create an instance variable, self.userblog, which is going to be equal to none. And if the user has an account, then we're going to make this user blog equal to the user's blog. And if they do not have an account, we're going to create the blog and then put the blog in that self.userblog variable. So user blog equals blog. This blog here, we put it in the user blog. And if they already have an account, blog equals database find one. If blog is not none, then we say self.userblog equals blog, return true, else return false. So if the blog is not none, meaning it exists, we set the user blog to be equal to the blog we found in the database, and then we return true. We've got an account, and now we've got a user blog. If the blog is none, meaning we didn't find anything in the database, we simply return false. And when we return false, we will prompt them for an account. Okay, so let's move on to the next video. We're going to be writing this run menu method. So I'll see you there. Okay, and welcome back. So let's write the run menu method. Remember, if the user decides they want to read, we're going to list the blogs in the database, allow the user to pick one of these blogs, and then display that blog's posts. If they want to write, we're going to prompt them to write a post. So, first of all, let's do the writing because it's shorter. So we're going to do here self.prompt write post. Then define that method. Prompt write post. And what we'll do is self.userblog.new post. And in doing this, notice how PyCharm did not give us an autocomplete. That is because up here, we did not manage to create an object of type blog. Instead, we found data, but we didn't create an object. So what we'll do here is, instead of self-user blog equals blog, where blog is some data that comes from the database, we'll say equals blog dot from Mongo blog ID. So now we have an object of type blog assigned to user blog in here, and an object of type blog assigned to user blog in here. However, it is possible that user blog might still be none at some point. So PyCharm does not recognize that this is always going to be a blog object. It is unlikely that that'll happen, but who knows? Maybe we would fail to create a blog or something along those lines. So now we've got an object here and an object here, which means most likely we will always have blog objects. So we can write new post here as well, which is the method that we created in the blog class. So user blog is a blog object. We can call the new post method on it, and that will prompt the user to create a new post inside that blog. And really that's everything this method has to do. So is there a need for us to create a method that will call a single method? Probably not. So we can copy that and replace it there, and then we can delete this method. It's not really necessary. Okay, now let's list the blogs in the database, allow the user to pick one, and display the posts of that blog. So we're going to do list the blogs first, self.list blogs, and then self.view blog. These are going to be the two methods here. So list blogs is going to be fairly simple. Simply going to find all of the blogs in the database and show them to the user and allow them to pick one. So blogs is database.find in blogs everything. So this would be collection, and this would be query. And then we would simply print out all the blogs. For blog in blogs, print ID, title, author, like so. Format blog ID, blog title, blog author. So we know what this does. Simply prints out the ID, the title, and the author of the blog. The ID is going to be a long ID, which is unavoidable, unfortunately, and then the user is going to have to copy it and paste it in order to be able to look at the blog posts. That is an unfortunate thing that we could call a design flaw in our program. Okay, so this is what we'll do there. And then that's everything. Print out the blogs, and then the view blog will ask the user to tell us which blog they want to view. So we'll say view blog now is going to be blog to see is input. Enter the ID of the blog you'd like to read, and then blog will be blog from Mongo blog to see. Remember, blog to see is going to be the ID of the blog. We're going to get it from Mongo, and that's going to be our blog variable there. And then posts is going to be blog.getPosts. For post in posts, we're going to print out each of the posts. Print date, title, and then \n that. And I'm going to explain exactly what that is. Post created date, post title, post content. And let me just go into the post and check that those are correct: title, content, and created date. It sounds correct. Okay, here. So what we're going to do here is format this string with a date, a title, and the content at the end. The \n, only thing it does, puts new lines on the text. So presses enter a couple of times and make sure that the content is printed out below the title and not on the same line as the title. So that's what that does. Okay, so this should be possible to simply now go ahead and press run and see what happens. So we're gonna just do that quickly in the next video, and then we'll be pretty much done with this app. So I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're simply going to write the app.py file that is going to execute the menu. So let's go to our app, delete all of this here, not import that, and say menu equals menu. We will have to import our menu, and remember that the menu does not take anything in the init method, so we don't have to give it anything. And then simply say menu.run menu. Now when we press play, we get asked to enter our author name. So I'm going to put my name in, and notice how it says welcome back Jose, because it already checks the database and realizes that I already exist in there. Then I can read some blogs, and then it prints out the blogs. These two blogs have the same title, which is unfortunate. I'm not sure which one I'm going to pick, but then we copy the ID and paste it in here, and then we get the post printed out. Then the program finishes, so we have to press play again. So that may not be ideal. And then if I enter Rolf, then it asks me to register. So enter blog title. I'm going to say awesome blog and enter blog description. Just type something here. And then it asks me whether I want to read or write blogs. So in this case, I want to write. So I type capital W. And it asks me to enter the post title, my post, my content, and the post date. So 10/03/2014. And then it finishes. If we go back in and type Rolf, it says welcome back Rolf. So now we can read and we can type our own ID and see what happens. And then we've got my post, my content. So this is how that would work, and now there's obvious improvements that we can do to ensure that the menu runs over and over again until we press something that isn't read or write. We could do that, and that would be fairly simple. Or we could improve the way to select a blog. Instead of having to copy and paste the ID, we could do something different, like use the title or have a shorter ID. The date could be displayed a bit better, especially if there is no times. I'm not really interested if it was created at midnight. So there are a lot of improvements we can do, but the purpose of this section was not to be stopped by those things, and instead focus on the other things, which is creating a reasonably complex app which uses MongoDB, which uses datetime, which uses object-oriented programming, and to introduce static and class methods. So actually, I would recommend really trying to understand this section very well, because it introduces a lot of the concepts that we're going to be using throughout the course. So if you do have any questions, please go and ask in the Slack group, ask me directly, and I will be more than glad to help you explain it again, recommend more reading materials or things like that. So please do attempt that, and also attempt the challenges in the next couple of lectures. They will also be beneficial for your learning. Okay, so hopefully you enjoy this section, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. So I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. In this section, we're going to be looking at APIs and REST interfaces. Now, you may have heard about APIs and REST interfaces before, and oftentimes they are quite confusing terms, because sometimes people don't understand really what they are, or they don't fully grasp the simplicity of what an API and a REST interface is. Now, an API and a REST interface are not the same thing. However, nowadays most APIs follow REST interface structures, especially web-based APIs. So we're going to look at what these things are exactly in a very quick video. But first, before we begin, imagine that you've got two applications. You've got a mobile application and a desktop app. And now both applications do the same thing, but one of them does it in a mobile and one of them does it in a desktop. And both of them get data from the same database. So what do you do? How do you structure your applications? Because both of them are using the same server, the same database. So one of the obvious options is to have duplicate code. Have the code to access the database duplicated. You've got the code written in your mobile app, and then you've also got it written in your desktop app. This is obviously not ideal because you've got to write the code twice, but it has one more drawback, which is that if you change the database, then you need to change the code in both places. So not only do you have to write the code twice, but whenever you make a change, you've also got to go and change both applications and ask your users to re-download them and all that. So not a very good solution. The better solution would be to create an API. And this stands for Application Program Interface. And that last word is really the key word. It is an interface. So it allows something to interface with something else through a simple structure, simple way. So what you would do is create a service that allows both applications to interact with the database without having to do that themselves. So what you would expect is your mobile app to send some data to this API, and then the API would put the data in the database. Or your desktop app could request some data to the API, and the API would get the data from the database and send it back. So this is essentially an interface between your applications and your database. So the applications only have to send data or request data and not worry about the database itself. So they would not be interacting with the database itself. Let's look at an example API. Let's say you've got this API living on this website, www.mysite.com/API. And now your applications are going to interact with this API, this website, requesting or sending data, and then the API is going to do the interaction with the database. One example of a request for data, you would ask the API to get something from the database, is just that, get, and then the API address. So let's have a look at this. The first word in pink here is get, and that tells your API that the application is expecting the API to send back some data, which the application can then use. The next part is the address of the API, in this case, www.mysite.com/API, and then you've got what's called the API endpoint, which is what exactly are we accessing in this API. And we can see that we're accessing users / and then a complicated number. And that number would be the user ID in this case. So this would be a unique identifier for your user. So therefore, we can read from here that the application wants to get some data related to a specific user with that ID. It's accessing the user's collection, and from that user's collection, it's accessing that specific ID. You would obviously have to program your API to do this, to accept this endpoint. Another example would be a post request. In this post request, we've got www.mysite.com/API, and then the endpoint is /users/new. If we access this endpoint with a post as opposed to a get, we're telling the API that we want to add some data to the database. And then we would also have to send it what data do we want to add. So in this case, we'd be adding the ID and the name of the user. The API would then worry about interacting with the database and putting that into the database. The application would only know that that was successful or unsuccessful. But obviously, not only get and post are the HTTP commands that we can use. HTTP is simply the protocol, the way that internet applications interact with one another. In a web-based API such as that one, we would need to tell it what do we want the API to do, as well as the URL or the address of the API. So we've seen get. When we send the API a request using the get keyword, we're asking it to retrieve something. We can use post, which we've seen, and that is used to tell the API to create something. But we can also use put, which is used to modify something. For example, to update a record on a table. You could change the user name, for example. And we've also got delete, which evidently deletes something from the database. So instead of get a specific user, you could send a delete a specific user request, and that would ask the API to interact with the database in a way that would delete the user. Remember, however, the applications don't know what that interaction entails. The application doesn't know what database is being interacted with, so they don't know if it's MongoDB or MySQL or any other type of database, for example. Okay, so what is REST? We've actually just looked at what REST is as well. REST is simply a way to structure these APIs, and that API that we saw a moment ago, that example API, was structured in a REST way. One of the key features of REST is that it is stateless. And what this means is that one API request does not affect the next. Evidently, if you delete a user, you wouldn't be able to get it the next time, but what this means is you can't chain requests in REST. Each request is independent, and it does something. So if you ask to delete a user, that user will be deleted. If you ask to get a user, you will get the user back, but it won't affect the way that the API works. Another key feature is resource-based. An API using REST is structured on a per resource basis. For example, you've got your students or your users or your blog posts or anything else. And this is very similar to objects in object-oriented programming. So you would have your /users/ID, for example, and you would get the ID, the user with that specific ID. Similarly, you could do the same with blog posts, or with furnitures, or with web page contents. So everything is resource-based, so that way it's very easy to understand exactly what's going on. So we've looked at what REST and what APIs are, but really this is quite an abstract concept, and the best way to understand it is by going in and creating our own API. So let's do that. I'll see you in the very next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to introduce a new library that we're going to be using for our API. This library is called Flask, and it is a very popular library in Python across the whole industry really, because it's really lightweight and really easy and fast to develop web applications and APIs with it. So this library is not only used for APIs, but it has a lot more functionality that lets you develop full-blown web applications using it very easily. So in this section we're going to be creating this weblog app that is really going to be a full-blown website that will interact with our database and do everything that you'd expect a blog to do. And we're going to do that right here in this section, and it's going to actually be a lot easier than you may have thought before. So the first thing to do is to create the source folder. I've already created a virtual environment for this project, and you should do the same. So create your source folder, and then you'll have your init.py here. Go on new Python file, and I'm going to call it app.py. So the first thing we have to do now is import the Flask framework. But before we do that, we'll have to go into our project and create a new file, which will be the requirements.txt file. Here we want to write Flask == 0.10.0. Remember, Flask has a capital F here. And then we'll go back to our app, and then it'll tell us that we have to install it. So we can do that. And then once that's installed, we can begin using the Flask library. So there it goes. And that's installed. And now we can say from Flask import Flask. Notice how this has a capital F, which means this is a class that we're importing. And now we can use this class to define our app. So we're going to tell Python that we are creating a Flask application. And in order to do that, we have to create an object of this Flask class. So we'll say app equals Flask __ name __. So what does this mean? Well, __ name __, that's kind of difficult to say. So name with 2 underscores on each side essentially is a built-in variable, sort of private variable in Python, and what it contains is essentially this. if we are running the application directly. So it's a bit difficult to understand, but don't worry about it very much, really. That's the only thing to say. Basically what this says is that we are giving the app a name, which is something that Python determines for us, and that can also be used to decide whether we are running the app directly from like a terminal or something like that or not. So it is a bit confusing, but we really don't have to worry about it at all. It doesn't affect us at all. Okay, so now we've defined our app, we can actually begin creating the API endpoints that are going to be used. So let's create a simple one. We simply say the @ symbol, app.route, and then here we put the endpoint. So I'm going to put just an empty endpoint here, just a /. And what that means is you would be going to www.mysite.com/API. So this would be the endpoint that we are creating here. And then we can define a method that will execute when we access that endpoint. So we can do something like that. So what this does is it defines an endpoint, which is an empty endpoint, and then when we access that endpoint with our browser, or when our mobile app or our desktop app accesses this endpoint, then this method will run. And what this method will do is it'll simply return the words hello world. There is one last thing we have to do in order to be able to run this Flask app, which is to say if name equals main, then say app.run. So this is what I meant before with all the explanation about what the main is. So basically what we're doing here is if we are running the app and expecting it to initialize and start from 0, then we'll actually run the app. And if the app is running as part of a separate process or something like that, then we will not run the app, and instead we'll leave it to that other process to run the app. So really not something you have to worry about. This is simply a requirement to run our app, really. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click the app and press run. And we can see the address is already in use because I've got a lot of other things running as well. So the first line is that the app is running on here, 127.0.0.1, and then colon 5000. So I've already got something else running on this port 5000. So what we can say is run on port 4995, for example. And then we'll press play again. Now notice how now it's running on 127.0.0.1 colon 4995. So let's access that and see what happens. So here I'm bringing in the window here, and notice how I've accessed the address 127.0.0.1 colon 4995, and the words hello world are coming out. And here in our logs we can see that the get keyword is coming here, and we've got this empty route first. So that empty route is the one we defined up here, and then we've returned the words hello world, which is what we've gotten here on our browser. So this is how the API works, and you've seen this is really not that complicated. You simply define the route or the route of your application interface, and then you define the method that will execute when something accesses that endpoint, and then that executes, and that's it. So that's how you can define something that will interface with something else. So we could define a route, for example, that will be /users/user ID, and then when we access that endpoint, we would get the information pertaining to that user. But obviously this all will sound a bit abstract until we actually start doing a lot of more things with it. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next few videos, and in fact in this section overall. So stick with me, and let's move on to the next one, and everything is going to be a lot clearer. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to be continuing with our API, and we are in fact going to be getting the entire structure for our web blog. So the first thing to do is to define exactly how the application is going to be structured. So we're going to have our blogs, we're going to have our posts, and we're going to have our users. So these are the three models that we're going to need. In addition, these models are also going to use one common class, which is going to be the database class. So I'm going to create a new package here, actually sorry about that, inside the source folder of course, a new package called models. And in this models package I'm going to have the blog, the post, and the user. And then I'm going to create another package which is going to be common, and here I'm going to have the database. So the database is really going to be the same as last time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Finder and then open up the database and get that. So I've got it here, I'm going to copy that and paste it in, and I'm going to remove that. And evidently we're going to need to import PyMongo as well. So PyMongo, but I forgot exactly what the version was, so we can go and look at the current version, 3.0.3. So then we'll install that, install the requirement, and then this should work with our local database. So remember, you have to have the MongoDB instance running in order for this to work. Okay, so what about the models? I'm not entirely sure what this means, by the way, just now. So if it doesn't work, then it'll be because it's missing some sort of import or something along those lines. So we'll have a look at that in a minute. Let's go into our models and create different models. So user, and also blog, and also post. So we can also get some of these from the last section. So we can get the blog, for example, from the last section. I'm just going to copy that and paste it onto the blog. And we're going to have to change some things, of course, such as the inputs. But we'll look at that in just a moment. And also I'm going to want to get the post from here. This is simply to save you time, so we don't have to go through typing it all again, really. The user does not have a model just now, and we'll work on that in a couple of videos' time. The first thing to do, however, is to realize that there are some things that we've done in our models that maybe aren't optimal. So, for example, we've got this blog model, this blog class, that has an init method, and in it we define the author, title, and description, and also an ID. This ID, it says that it shadows the built-in name ID. That's not a big problem. This ID, however, is not the same ID that MongoDB gives its documents by default. So MongoDB will also give each document an ID called _ID, like so. And in fact, when we are writing these models to the database, we are giving them an ID, and we're also giving them an _ID, which MongoDB gives by default. So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that we are overwriting the MongoDB default ID with our ID. So what we're going to do is rename our ID to _ID. So this is what we've done here. And then self._ID down here as well. Self._ID there. Self._ID there and there. And then here. There. So you can see there are a few things that we've had to change in order to make this change. Now, if you had multiple apps, you would have to make this change in all of them for it to work. But now, because we're developing this API, all our apps are going to be able to interact with this and not have to worry about whether we're using _ID or just ID. Okay, so I think that's everything. We don't have to really worry about this one because that's simply a parameter. It's not going anywhere near the database or the object. So that's fine. That's that. And these. So I think we're good. This is now, we are overriding the default MongoDB _ID by our own, which we're using UID4 for. Okay, and then we can go into the post and do essentially the same thing. So we're going to override that, and then self.id, I'm going to press Shift and F6, and then we can rename them to that, and then it renames them all. But obviously it won't rename the strings, so we're going to have to do that. Okay, so I think that's it. We're going to need to import database, which is no longer, oh sorry, that was not what I wanted to do. We are going to have to say src.common.database, import database, and in here as well. And here we're going to have to say src.models.post, import post. Okay. So our imports are now sorted as well, and there's one final thing that we should probably do in order to simplify our models, and this is the use of the CLS keyword. So as we know, the CLS keyword essentially stands for the class. So what this is doing is it's returning an object of type post in this case. And when we use this in the blog class, then it would return an object of type blog. However, this is quite a lot of parameters to be passing our post. And if you notice, we're saying blog_id equals post data, and then inside the quotations, we're accessing the blog_id field from the database. So we're getting this stuff from the database, and then we're saying blog_id equals blog_id, title equals title, content equals content, author equals author, date equals created date, _id equals _id. So we're doing something quite repetitive here. We are telling it that the blog_id field of the object is the blog_id field from the database. And the only one that's different is this date. And date equals created date, in fact, from the database. So the first thing we want to do before we continue is change that so that the date is the created date. So here I'm going to change that to created date, and here I'm going to change that to created date. And then I'm going to change that to created date. And I think that is all the changes we have to do. So now all of the properties are equal. One of them is the object property, and the other one is the one coming from the database. Now we can simplify all of this to ** post data. That does exactly the same thing. It says for each of the elements in post data, get the name of the element when it's coming from the database and say that the object element is equal to that. So basically it's doing, if I go to the post, so to the blog class, it's doing author equals blog data author, title equals blog data title. It's simply saying this author is the name of the variable in the object as well. Sorry, the name of the parameter to the constructor. So therefore, we can simplify that in order to simply decrease the complexity of our code. And I'm changing the created date there because we've changed that in the post constructor as well. Okay, so the blog also can be simplified. Self-author equals author, and then title, description, and _id. And here, when we are getting it from MongoDB, we're saying author equals blog data author, title equals blog data title, description equals blog data description, and ID equals blog data _id. So we want to change that to _id, and then we can get that and simplify it to asterisk blog data. And that does exactly the same thing. Okay, so now these models are simplified as best we can. Now what we're going to do in the next video is change them in order for them to be suitable for the API we're developing, as opposed to for the text-based blog entry we developed in the last section. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to make our models match the new user flow that is going to be coming through our web API, web application, into our API and then into these models. So evidently, when we're using a web API, the user is going to be on the browser. They're going to be filling in a form with the post content, for example, and then they're going to press submit, and then that data is going to come through our API into our model, and then our model is going to write it in the database. So obviously our model will not be asking the user for any input at this stage, the user will have already written that on the website or on the mobile app. So we don't want to be asking the user for this data at that stage. Instead, this method will require the data as a parameter, and we'll give that through the API. So title, content, date. And now, if date is not set, then we want to use UTC now, which is the current date. So what we'll do is we'll give date a default value of the date UTC now. And if not, then we'll use the specific dates that the user sent us, or the API sent this model rather. So we no longer need that either. And then this is all we need. We'll pass the new post a title, content, and a date, and then we'll create it under this blog. The rest of the methods are actually valid for our API format. To get all the posts for a specific blog, we'll simply call that. To save to MongoDB, we'll just use that method. It's fairly simple. To get the JSON back and to get the blog from MongoDB, we're also going to be able to call that through our API, because it doesn't depend on the user giving us any data. Okay, let's go into the post and see what we have to change, if anything. And we can see that the blog post gets initialized with all these details. That's fine. Save to Mongo will be fairly simple. The user will simply write something, and then the API will call this save to Mongo and insert the new post. So that's not a problem. The JSON will simply return a representation of this post. That's nothing that the user has to interact with at this stage, at least. And the from Mongo and from blog are methods that the user does not need to give us anything for. So we don't have to modify them just yet either. So we can see now that the blog and the post are two models that are essentially stateless. We can't do anything in them except save them or get them. So we're not asking the user to interact with the model while the model is doing things. So that's fine, because the user is going to be giving us the data before we get to this layer. The user is in fact going to be giving us the data before we get to the API layer. The user is going to be writing in the website. The website is then going to send the data to the API. The API is going to send it to this model, and the model is going to save to the database. So as long as we are expecting data in this model, then we're fine. Okay, so what else? We're going to have to create a user model as well. So the user model is simply going to be something to let our users log in and register and create new posts and things like that. So let's get started with that. An init method. Then we're going to need a method to get from Mongo. But instead of calling it from Mongo, I'm going to call it get by email. And then I'm going to create another one, get by ID, which is going to, these two methods are going to allow us to get the users by filtering through email address or by filtering through ID. Then I'm going to check login valid. This is going to be a method that will check whether a user email matches the password they sent us. So this is necessary so that this method will essentially check that the login that the user sent us, the username and the email and password combination, is a valid username and password combination or not. And then we're going to have something for register. We're going to have something for login. Notice this is not checking whether the login is valid, but actually logging the user in. And then we're going to have something like get blogs. And that's probably it for now. If we do end up having more things that we'll need, we'll simply add them in. So in the next video, we're going to be writing some of these methods. So I'll see you in the next one. Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be going over how to create a user model. Let's compare it to the blog model, for example. In the blog model, we've got a few methods that we're missing actually in the user model, such as save to Mongo or JSON, and we're going to add those in just now. And all of these simply interact with the database by using the collection and using the JSON method. And then they store some information as well. So the user is going to be the same thing. So the first thing we have to think about is what information or what data is the user model going to be holding. And in order to think of that, we can think of what is the user going to do when they get to our website. They're going to want to register or log in. And in order to register or log in, we're going to need an email and a password. And users are also going to have a list of blogs. But the blogs really are not part of the user, but the user owns them. So they don't necessarily have to be inside the user model. So really, what I'm getting to here is the only thing we need is email and password for the user. And we can store those two in the user model, and then when we save to the database or see if the different things the user does, we can use the email and password to verify things. So let me create the JSON and save to Mongo methods, because we forgot last video. And now let's begin by the first one, get by email. So get by email is a fairly simple method. What we have to do is say database, import the database, dot find one, and then the users collection, which is users. And then find by email is simply going to be email is self email. That makes sense. And then say data is equal to that. And this will either be a user or none if no user was found with that email. So if data is not none, return, and we'll return CLS asterisk data. However, this CLS, we don't have it because we said we're using the current object. And we don't really want to do that, so we're going to have to change this to a class method and change that to CLS. Instead of self.email, we will pass the email in. And why am I doing this? Why not use self? Simply because when we're getting a user by an email, we won't already have a user. So we won't have a current object at that time. When we're calling this method, what we'll be interested in is in looking at the database and finding the user. We won't yet have the user object. So that's why this has to be a class method. And for the same reason, this other method has also got to be a class method too. And get by ID is actually going to be pretty much the same, except instead of email, we're going to use the underscore ID, which of course reminds us that we should also have the ID here. And I'm going to go into the blog and copy that because that makes more sense. Okay, so now we're assigning an ID to our user as well if they don't have one, or if they do have one, then it'll just get passed through. Okay. The login valid is simply to check whether they are logged in, whether the password that they've given us is correct or not. So the first thing to do is say user equals user.find by email, get by email rather, and then here we'll pass the email that we are getting here. Now this user will either be a valid user object, remember we are creating the user object here, or it will be none, which is the default return type. So this is default in Python. So if we don't write anything, then if data is none, it'll not do that, and instead it will return none. So user will either be a valid user or it will be none. So if user is not none, then we can check the password. If the user is none, then we'll return false because it means that the login is invalid. The user doesn't exist. So if user is not none, we will check the password. So return user password equals password, and the password will be passed as a parameter. Okay, so what this does is, sorry, actually this will be a full stop there. User.password equal password. This creates the user object, and then if the user is not none, it means we found one. So then we can check the password, see if the user.password, the password from the database, is equal to the password that is passed to this login_valid method. However, this login valid method does not need self for anything, so we might as well make it static. And now that makes a bit more sense. We can do now user.loginValid School of Code, and then the password. We can do that, and then that will return true if that email and password combination is valid, or false if it is not valid. Okay, so that's how we would check that. And then in order to register, it's going to be pretty much the same. So it's once again going to be a static method, and it's going to get an email and password as parameters, and what it's going to do is if the user already exists, then it will fail, and if the user does not already exist, then it will create the user. So the first thing we have to do is user get by email with this email, and if user is none, user doesn't exist, so we can create it. Else user exists. So if the user does not exist, we can create the user. So what we'll do is say new user equals user email password, and then new user save to Mongo. And if the user already exists, we will return false. Okay, so if this makes sense, then that's fantastic. We're getting the user by email, and this will either return none if the user does not exist, or it will return something if the user does exist. So if the user is none, it means it does not exist, so we can create it. And if the user is not none, it means the user exists, so we cannot create it, and we return false. We are using the user class here, but that's the current class we're in. So rather, instead of making this a static method, we can actually make it a class method and use CLS there. And instead of user here, use CLS there. And now you wonder, why would you do that? Quite simply because if we change the user class name, then we don't have to change this method. So that makes it a bit easier. But really, that's the only reason. So not particularly optimal. I mean, it's not an optimized operation, but it simply saves us time later on if we do decide to change something. Okay, so this is not a very nice method because it will either return none. This is the default. Return none will happen here because we're not returning anything. So the default will be to return none. We're returning none if the user was created okay, and we're returning false if the user was not created okay. To me, returning none does not immediately sound like a good thing. In fact, it sounds like something was missing. So probably we should return true here. And returning false makes sense because we failed to register, but we are not giving any information as to why we failed. So we should probably tell the application layer that the user already exists, so that then we can show the user a message in the website. But we're not going to worry about that just now, because it adds a little bit of complexity to the issue here. So let's not worry about that, and just return false, which means we failed. And we can show the user a message saying we could not register you at this time, or something along those lines. All right. So the next few things to do would be to create these other methods. But this video is getting a bit long, so we're going to leave that for the next video. So I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to be looking at logging in our users. But in order to do that, we need to look at sessions as well. Now, two concepts we're going to be using in this video are that of cookies and sessions. Now, most of you will know what a cookie is, and a cookie is simply a way to store information on a web browser. So we can send the user a cookie, and then we can store in their browser some information. For example, their email address. Now, say we were storing the user's email address in a cookie, sending them to the user, and then expecting that cookie to come back to our application every time the user makes a request. So the user logs in, we store the email in the cookie, and then the user presses the profile, and we use that email that we stored in the cookie to load the user profile. That works because the user is a very honest person and does not modify the email in the cookie. Similarly, if the user was not such an honest person, we could modify the email in the cookie manually through the web browser, and then when we press it profile, we would load a different profile, a profile of a different user. And then this user would be able to modify the other user's passwords, for example. So what we do instead is use sessions as well as cookies. So what we do is, instead of storing the email in the cookie and sending that cookie to the user, we store the email on the server away from the user. And then what we send the user is a unique identifier for the session. So when the user accesses their profile, they send us the unique identifier, and we use that identifier to get the user's email that is associated with that cookie. Because these identifiers are very long and complex numbers, they're not really going to be able to guess somebody else's number. So therefore, this is a much more secure method of doing this. So a session is like a cookie, but stored server-side. Sessions usually also have an expiry time. So for example, they may expire after 1 hour. Cookies usually expire after a much longer period of time. So when we're trying to log in our users, the only thing we have to do is say, now you're logged in, and store that information, the fact that they are now logged in the database. So the way I'm going to do this is say session email equals user email. And then this login method is going to be static and is going to take in a user email. And then I'm going to have to import this from flask.session. Now, I understand that it's not yet been fully explained. What am I storing here? How do I know that the user is logged in? And how does the application know that the user is logged in? So what we are going to do is login valid has already been called. So when we call login valid has already been called. So we know that the user has a valid email and password. And then what we do is simply store their email in the session. Now, next time the user accesses their profile, for example, they will send us a unique identifier in their cookie. This cookie will be able to identify this session, and this session will store their email. Because the session has the email stored, we know this is a logged in user. If the session does not have an email, it means the user has not yet logged in, because we're only storing the user email in the session when they log in. But we should also do that when they register. And why, you may say? So here we're creating the new user and we're saving it to MongoDB, so the user has now registered. What we want to do is that the user already appears logged in after they register. In order to do that, we simply put their email inside the session. Fortunately, in Flask, we don't have to work with the cookies. So Flask does the cookies for us. Whenever the user accesses our application, Flask will send them a cookie that is secure and that uniquely identifies their session. So the only thing we have to do is put their email in the session, and then Flask will already know that the user's cookie matches this session. Okay, so remember this only happens when they register or when they log in. If we want them to log out, the only thing we have to do is a session email equals none. And then this user is not logged in now. So fairly simple way of doing it. You need to understand a bit about sessions and cookies, but not a lot really. Let's work on the JSON method, because this method is going to be fairly simple. The only thing we have to do in this JSON method is return the email, the underscore ID, and we have to think whether we want to return the password or not. So say, for example, the user accesses their profile. Are we going to use this JSON method to get the details that we're going to display in their profile? Because if we are, then we do not want to send the password as well. Sending passwords over a network is never safe. So we want to think about, are we going to be using this method in communications between the user and the application, or only inside the application? Because if it's only inside the application, then we can send the password through. After all, if it's not going through the network, then we're fine. And indeed, because we use this method when saving to MongoDB, as we will in a moment, then it might be worth putting it there. However, you must remember that this is not safe to send over a network. The passwords, as of now, are not encrypted, which means we're storing passwords in plain text in the database, which is also very unsafe, and we will work on that in the next few videos as well. Okay, so we're saving to MongoDB, and the way we're doing that is simply database.insert, not that one, sorry, insert, and then we're using the users, and we are storing self.json. Okay, so that's how we would save to MongoDB, and now we've got everything working except the getBlogs method. So we're going to work on that in the very next video. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to be going over how to write the getBlogs method. So one of the key things we have to realize when we are trying to get the blogs for a specific author is, how are the blogs structured in the database? What sort of data are we saving for any specific blog? So what to do is to go over here to our database, and as you can see I've executed db.blogs.find, and that is going to give me all of the blogs in the database, and that way I can check the structure of the documents that are stored in this blogs collection. As we can see, for each of the blogs we are storing an ID, the author, a description, and a title. So one of the first things that we may realize is that we're not storing an author ID. We're only storing an author name. Now, names, as you know, multiple people can have the same name, so searching by author name might not be the smartest thing to do. So in order to fix that, we're going to have to go back into our blog model and make sure that we're saving the author ID as well as the blog ID and the author name. And that way we'll be able to search through by author ID. So the first thing to do is go into our blog model, and here as we can see we've got author, title, description, and underscore ID. And remember, this is the constructor, which means for every blog object that we create we're going to have these 4 properties. And I'm going to add as well an author ID. Notice that I'm not giving this a default value because it's not an optional parameter. All blogs need to have an author. And I'm going to just put it here, self author ID equals author ID. And we're also going to have to go and change the JSON. And that is pretty much it. However, the only way to search for blogs right now through this model is with this from Mongo method. This from Mongo method takes in the blog ID and then finds one blog with that _ID. We want to create another method that will allow us to search by author ID. So I'm going to create a method called findByAuthorID, which is a class method because it's going to return a list of blog objects that takes in the author ID, which is the author that we're going to find blogs of. And then we're going to say blogs equals database.find, collection equals blogs, which is the collection we're looking for. We're looking for the data in. And then the query is actually going to be author ID. Sorry, you can't really see that because the mouse is in the way. Author ID is the author ID that we are passing it in. And this will find all of the blogs with this author ID. And then we'll say return. And now we're going to do some list comprehension. We're going to return a list of blog for blog in blogs. So as you remember from the list section, the list lecture, we are going to be creating a blog for each of the blog in the blogs list here that we found. However, remember that this is going to return data from the database and not blog objects. So what we want to do is in fact this CLS ** blog. So we're going to do CLS ** blog. And this will now return a list of blog objects for each of the blogs in this blogs list, which is the data that we found from the database with this specific author ID. And now we've got this way to find blogs by author ID, which means we can go back to our user model and modify this getBlogs method that is, as of yet, initialized, undefined. So what to do is say return blog dot find by author ID self dot _ID. And I'm just going to have to import this. And now what this will do is when we call a specific author's getBlogs method, we will find all of the blogs with his or her author ID. So I understand there is a flow of data going from each of the models, and you have to keep a mental model in your head as to how the program is structured and how the different things interact with one another. And that is the most difficult thing to do in programming and in software engineering as a whole, I think, which is to keep this flow of how the data moves from one class to another and from one layer to another, the database to your application to the user. Keep all that in your head, or at least the part that is needed at the current time, in order for you to understand the way that you have to design your software. So this is how simply you could find by an author ID all of the blogs for that specific author. Remember, we have modified the blog model to include the find by author ID. We've modified the database storage for the blog by including the author ID, and then we've simply gone into our user model and made sure that we can find the blogs for a specific author just like that. Okay, let's move on to the next video. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So we've got the functionality in place to get blogs from a specific user. Now we need to add in the ability to create a new blog and to create a new post. And these are going to be fairly simple. Let's begin by creating a new blog. Now, in order to create a new blog, we're going to need the constructor parameters for the blog. So we're going to go into the blog model and just have a look at exactly what it needs. And as we can see, it needs an author, title, description, author ID, and potentially an ID. However, when we're creating a new blog, we don't need to provide it an ID because, as we know, it's going to generate its own unique identifier. So really the only thing we need is an author, a title, a description, and an author ID. I'm going to copy that and just put it there as a comment. And now what we have to remember is that the user is going to interact with the website. They're going to write the author, the title, and the description on the website, and then the website is going to send us data. And I'll rectify. They won't be writing the author. They will only be writing the title and the description. The author and the author ID is going to be coming from their session. So when the user is logged in, they will write the title and the description of the new blog, but because they're logged in, we know who they are, so we can fill in the author and the author ID for them. Okay, so the new blog is really going to take a title and a description. And then what we're going to do is say blog is a new blog object. This is the class. And we're going to instantiate a new blog object with author is self dot email. Or potentially we could be storing the author name as well if we wanted. Title is title, which is passed to us as a parameter to this method. It will be coming from the website that the user is interacting with. The description is equal to description, which is also coming from the website. And finally, the author ID is self._ID, which is the current author's ID. And then what we have to say is simply blog.save to Mongo, and that will save this new blog that they've created to MongoDB. Okay, so that's how we create a new blog. And do notice we're not doing any checking regarding is there a duplicate title or is there any security flaws regarding HTML or anything. So this is just a very bare bones saving to Mongo, creating a new blog, and that's it. And in order to create a new post, we're going to follow, in fact, a similar sort of procedure. The first thing to do is go to the blog model and see what the new post method requires. So it requires a title and a content and potentially a date. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to write that in here as a comment to remind me, just for the time being, for a couple of minutes while we write this method, what these parameters need to be. And we're going to need a title, content of the blog post, and potentially a date. And the date is going to have also a default value. I'm going to import that. So why am I doing this? Why am I copying these things up there? And remember, the user is going to be interacting with the website, writing their blog on the website, and then pressing submit. And when they press submit, the website is going to send us a title and a content. Now the user may also want to write a date, and if they write a date, the website will send us a date. If they do not write a date, then we will use a default value here. Okay, and something else that we will also need is which blog are we writing this to, because a user may have multiple blogs. And now the website will be sending us this blog ID when the user presses submit, so the user won't be writing that themselves. So then what to do is find out what blog it is. So blog equals blog from Mongo with this blog ID, and this will return us a blog object with this specific ID, and then we can say blog.newPost with this title equals title, content equals content, date equals date. And that's it. So easy enough. We'll get the title, we'll get the content, and we'll get the date. And notice how the date may be the default value. And the website will send us the blog ID without the user having to write it themselves. And that's all we need to be able to find out which blog we're writing into, and then putting the content into the database. So I'm going to go back into the blog model just to check if we've missed anything. And going over this new post, this simply creates the post with the details, and then it saves that to MongoDB. So yeah, we don't really have to do anything else. We don't have to save the post to MongoDB ourselves because that method is already doing it for us. So this is all you need in order to write a new post. And notice how it says that this may be static, and it could be static indeed, because we aren't using any of the user's values when executing this. So the blog already exists, which means we do not need the user's ID for anything, and we don't need the email or the password for anything else. So really, we could make this static, and then we can remove the self. Okay, now I'm going to remove these comments from here because they don't really tell us anything else, and that's us ready to start developing the website itself, the front end, the user-facing pages, and also the API that site is going to be using to interact with all of these models. So that's some exciting business there, and it's going to be a bit challenging, but not too difficult. So stick with me and let's get it done. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to be starting with the front end of our program. The first thing to do is to go into the source folder and create a new directory and call it templates. It should ideally have this name, as this is the default name in Flask. So if you use the templates name, then you won't have to change anything in your application. Then go into it again, into the source folder, and create another directory called static. Inside this static folder, create more directories, one called CSS, one called JS, and one called assets. Okay, so if you've done any sort of web development before, you'll know that CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, JS stands for JavaScript, and the assets are simply going to be images and font and things like that that our website may or may not require. So a cascading style sheet, or CSS, is simply used to give your website a styling. So for example, you can change the size of fonts or the color of backgrounds, or you can put images in backgrounds or add borders to things and things like that. So all sorts of styling related info goes in CSS files. JavaScript is a client-side scripting language. So what I mean with client-side is JavaScript does not run where your application runs. It runs in the user's browser. So when the user presses a button, for example, JavaScript may do something like show an alert, show a small window, or change the color of something on the website, or anything really. But the key feature of JavaScript is that it runs in the user's browser and not on your server. And that is interesting because it reduces the load on your server. Your server has to do fewer things because JavaScript is doing some of them. But also it means that you depend on the user having JavaScript enabled. And also there are some security restrictions when using JavaScript, and we will look at those throughout the course. Finally, your assets, as I said, are just images and fonts. The templates folder are going to be your HTML files. And HTML is hypertext markup language. And essentially, HTML file describes the structure of your website. So we've looked at XML before, very quickly of course, and we agreed, well I agreed, that XML was used to define the structure of some data. So for example, we could define that we had a set of students and then the names of each of the students. HTML is actually very similar. You can define what type of thing is on your website. So for example, some text or some images or some links, things like that. So HTML defines the way your site is structured. CSS defines the way it is displayed. And JavaScript adds some interaction with the user. Okay, so the first thing to do is going to be create a new template. and go into new HTML file and call it base. This base.html file is actually going to be essentially describing the layout of the page. All of our other pages are going to live inside this base.html page. So what we're going to do in the next video is define the header, the title of your page, and the footer, and then we're going to say where are the other pages going to live inside this one. So that may sound a bit confusing, but worry not, it's actually really simple, and we're going to get into it in the very next video. So I'll see you there. Okay, so in the last video, saying where the other pages are going to live inside this one may have sounded a bit confusing, and it may not have been strictly true. So the other pages aren't actually going to be pages. And let's start by defining the body of our page, and that will make things clearer. So the body of a HTML document is what is shown to the user. The head is what is not shown to the user, but can do things like import static files like CSS or JavaScript files. It can do things like set the title of your page and things like descriptions and other things for Google to be able to index your page properly and things like that. So the head is not shown to the user, the body is shown to the user. So in order to be able to create these pages reasonably easily, we want to avoid having to rewrite the head and the footer in every page. What we want to do is instead be able to simply say this head is going to be shared across all of our pages. So for example, let's say we want all of our pages to have this title called Fancy Blog, for example, or any title you wish. And then what we would say is say, using what's called Jinja templating language, just copy what I'm doing just now, and I'll explain it in a moment. We're going to say this. And this is not HTML, it is Jinja. And Jinja is a language that is used to simplify the creation of HTML, and Python, and in fact Flask, uses it for this purpose. So what this does is it says inside the body we're going to define a block, and this block is called content, and that's everything it's doing. It's defining a block of HTML code that will be going in this section once we have written it. So if we go into our templates and create a new HTML file and we call it something like login, now we can delete all of that and simply come in here and say extends base.html and then say block content end block. And here we can write whatever it is that the login page is going to display our users. So it would be something like a field for username and a field for password. So as you can see, this extends base.html simply places the content that we write in here inside this page, replacing this block here. And then if we wanted to create a register page, we would simply have to copy this, but with different content inside this block. So it simplifies the process because we no longer need to have all of this in it. We simply have to have whatever content is interesting for our login page. So let's go ahead and create the login page. The first thing to do is define where the content is going to live. So if we want to create something that the user can interact with and fill in some details, we're going to need what's called a form. And a form is just that, is something that the user can fill in and then press a button for submit. And then we need an input. And the input is something that the user can interact with and write something to. It's things like text fields or password fields or checkboxes and things like that. And an input of type text is simply a text field. And an input of type password is just a password field where the text is hidden with the small bullet points instead of showing the text. Okay, so as well as the type and the input, we need to be able to identify which of these is which. So we need to be able to know which one is the username and which one is the password. In order to do that, we're going to give one of these input fields an ID, an identifier. Sorry, oh, that was not what I wanted to do. Instead of username, we're going to use email, and here we're going to use password. Okay. Now the user is going to be able to see these two input fields when they navigate to it in their browser. Now, there is one small caveat. This code here cannot be rendered by a browser, so a browser doesn't know what this code means. Python knows what this code means. So in order for our users to be able to essentially use this code, we need to not access this file directly, but instead give it to them with our Python code. So we have to create another one of these endpoints, and we have to do what's called rendering the template. If we do not do that and instead click one of these icons here, what we see is this. But we do have our two input fields here. This one is a text field, and that one's a password field. So in order to be able to use these codes, and for them to make sense, we have to render the template using Python. So let's do that. Go into your app.py, and instead of returning hello world here, what we're going to return is render template. And we are going to have to import this. And the template we want to render is login.html. Flask already knows that this template lives in a templates folder. Okay, so then we press play, and we can then go into Chrome and say 127.495, and notice how that code is now disappeared. Okay, so now we've rendered the login.html template, and we've displayed these two things here. But there is no submit button, so we have to create that. And this is how we would do that. So now go back into Chrome and refresh, and there we have our submit button there. And now the only thing we've done is really created another type of input of type submit and given it an identifier of submit button. And I do realize we're not going into much depth with HTML here. If you do find it a bit confusing, worry not, we will keep exploring it. I don't really want to bore you with this is how you make all of these different things in HTML, because you just don't need them just now. But as we do need them, we will go over them. Okay, so by the way, if we go into Chrome, notice how the title is fancy blog up here, which is what we've defined. But the login page has no title defined. It is indeed extending it from the base.html page. Okay, so in the next couple of videos, we're going to be creating a few basic CSS files and adding them to our page, making sure that the login form looks a bit better. And then we're going to make sure that the login form actually does something. And we are going to also make the registration form. So I'll see you in the next couple of videos, and we're going to be able to add our users to the page and start interacting with them. So I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So the first thing to do is going to be to create our first CSS file. So go into your static CSS folder and create a new file. If you see style sheet in that menu, then create a new style sheet. If not, simply create a new file called main.css. You can name it whatever you want, of course. And now here we're going to have to do something to define the style of our fields. So if you remember from the last video, we had a very basic website. So we've got two fields and a submit button. These are the default fields and submit button for Mac OS X, which is what I'm using. If you're using Windows or if you're using Internet Explorer, they might be slightly different. And they are here at the top left of the page. They're all very close together. It's not a very pretty site, essentially. So what we want to do at first is to make sure that they're not appearing at the very top of the page. So how would we do that? Well, the first thing we have to realize is CSS can interact with any element in your page such as long as it knows how to get to it. So let's go into our base.html file and find out where this login form is. So this login form is inside the HTML block, then it is inside the body block, and then it is inside a form, and then we have the three input types there. So as we can see, we've got HTML, then body, and then form, and then the input types. This form does not have any way of identifying it as unique, which means that we can essentially interact with the form as an entity, and if we had more, we would interact with them all at the same time. Or we can give it an unique identifier, and then we can interact with this specific form. So if we chose to interact with all forms, then if we had another form, both forms would be interacted with. If we give it a unique identifier, we can interact with this one only. So let's give it a unique identifier of login-form, and I'll explain really what I mean with interacting with all of them or just one of them. In our main.css file, we can do something like this: form, and then we can define some styles inside these brackets. Now, form is a CSS entity. It is this thing here. So if we did this, and we define some styles for this keyword, all of the forms in our website would use these styles. So that may be what we want, or maybe we want the login form to have a different set of styles from the registration form or from the contact us form, if we had them. So instead of interacting with all of the forms on the website, we're going to interact with just one, the login-form. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to paste that here. But of course, CSS needs a way to know that this is not an HTML entity. This is different from just form, because this is one specific form. In order to do that, we put the hash symbol in front. And this tells us we're going to interact with an element with this ID. So now we've found out that this is our form, and we can give it some styles. So the first thing we wanted to do, as we said before, was separate it a bit from the top. So in order to do that, we're going to give it some margin. So we say margin-top, 25px, and semicolon, 25 pixels. And then we save that. And if we were to go into Chrome and run this right now, we would actually see no difference at all. I'm going to refresh this, and notice how it's still at the top left. So we have written our main.css file, but we haven't linked it to our HTML file. So we go into our base.html, and here under the title, we're going to say we want to link this page to that CSS file and use the styles defined in it. So we say link rel, and this is the type of element that we're linking, so it's a style sheet. And then href is where the document lives. Using Flask, we want to use a specific way to reference these elements. So do open and close curly braces, two of them, and then we're going to say URL_for static, and then file name equals css/main.css. And then we can close that. So what have we done here? We've defined a link to a style sheet with the following reference: for, too many M's there, URL for the static folder, and the file name is css/main.css. So inside the CSS folder, the main.css file. And in order, the reason why we do this is because Flask is going to be seeing this in our page and saying, ah, you want something that's in a different folder, so I'm going to replace this for the HTML code that would lead you there. So what HTML would lead us there? We are in the base.html file, so we'd have to go, we're inside the templates folder, base.html file, so we'd have to go up a folder into the source folder, then go into the static folder, then go into the CSS folder, and then into the main.css folder. So instead of this, what we would have to do is ... to go up a folder, and then static, and then CSS, and then main.css. We would have to do that if we did not want to use the URL for method. But because we've got Jinja, we can do this. Remember, if you're just making HTML files, you cannot do this. You can only do this with Flask and Jinja. We can do this, which simplifies the process, because if we then move our template elsewhere, normally, if we moved our template elsewhere, we would have to do something like that. Go up 2 folders, and then static, and then CSS, and then main.css. So if we moved our templates, we would have to append 2 dots before all of our references. So right now we've only got 1, but if we had more, then that would be a bit of a hassle. So instead, we simply tell Jinja to calculate it for us. And that's the way we do it. Okay, so now let's go back into Chrome and refresh this, and now we can see that the form has indeed gone down. So we've linked the style sheet to the base, and the login extends the base, so it's also linked to it. And now the form has that style. Okay, so quite a lot of info to digest in just one video, so I'll leave it there for now, and then I'll see you in the next one where we're going to be actually doing something with the login form. So I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So last video we did the very first of our CSS styling, but we're not really going to get too caught up in that just now, because we're going to be using a framework that will simplify the styling process called Bootstrap. And instead we're going to try and make our form do something, which is log in a user. So let's go into our app.py and define a new endpoint. So I'm going to say app.root/login. And now this /login is going to get the contents of that form, get the email and password, and log the user in if they are valid. So remember, we have to define a method that will get called when that login endpoint gets reached. And in this login user method, I'm going to say email is request.form email, and I'm going to have to import this request from Flask. There we go. And password is request.form/password. Now, email and password have to be the 2 fields that we have in the login form. So let's go and check. Okay, email and password are here, but they are IDs. So instead of ID, we're also going to have to use name. And that is simply so we can associate these values with a specific field name. Okay, let's go back to our app.py. Now we've got here request.form and then email. So a request is simply something that is incoming to our application. So the website is going to make a request to our application. And in this request, the form is going to send some data. And the data the form sends in Flask is always inside the request.form dictionary. So now we've got here a dictionary that contains all the data inside the form, and we're going to access the name email and the name password. Okay, so then what we'll do is if user, import that, login valid with this email and password, then we'll say user.login email. Okay. And then what we do at the end is return render template, like profile.html, for example. And we haven't made this page just yet, but we will make it. Okay, so to recap, we're getting the email in a form and the password as well, and then we are checking that the login is valid and then logging in the user. Remember, this sets the session email to be the user's email, and we've looked at it before. And finally, once that session email is set, we return render template. In normal circumstances, we would do something else if the login was not valid, such as tell the user the login was invalid and then redirect them to the login page again. But for the sake of simplicity, let's leave it as this just now. So once the user is logged in, we want to render this template. And what we're going to do is say, we want to render this template, but we want to render the template with some data that is coming from the application. So we're going to say email is session email. And we'll have to import this as well. So what is this? What's happening here? We're calling render template like we did before, but now we're giving it something else as well. Well, we didn't know this was a thing that you could do, but actually it is. And you can give a render template function any data that you want. So we can just separate with commas more and more data that we want to pass this template. And now that means that this template here has access to this email variable inside it, and that email variable contains the session's email. Okay, so that sounds confusing enough. So let's go and create our profile template. And notice, just like before, I'm going to go into the login and select everything and copy that and replace it here. And now instead of a form, of course, we want to say something like H1 stands for header 1, hello, and then email. Okay, so header 1 is the biggest header you can get in HTML. It is essentially a big title. And then we're going to say hello, and then inside these two curly braces, we're going to put the Jinja variable, that is email. And that variable was passed here. And that should contain the session email once the user has logged in. Okay, but right now we don't have any users in our database, so we have to do that first. So the first thing to do is going to go to my terminal and say db.users. Let me check that is the correct collection. db.users.insert. And I'm going to insert email is test@test.com. Password is just going to be password. And that's it. So we've inserted that, and we've got the email and the password. So let's go back to our app.py and see what happens. So the first thing to do is actually rerun the application because we've changed the endpoint here. So we'll rerun that. Go into Google Chrome, refresh that, and then test@test.com password. And hurrah! We've got our data up here on the URL. So the form is thinking that it has to send data to itself, and this is the default behavior for a form. So we want to tell it, no, form, actually you have to send data to a different place, which is where the data is expected. So we're going to go back into PyCharm, go into the login form, and say action is /login, and then it will send the data over to this page. So when we do this, we are actually going to get a small error. So let's go in here, refresh that, and type again. And we get a bad request. So why do we get a bad request? And the truth is, we are sending, well, even without worrying about the bad request, really, we've got a bigger problem than the bad request. But it turns out that solving this problem solves the bad request as well. We've got the problem that we're sending a password here through the URL. And this is probably the least safe thing you can do. This is the most unsafe thing you can do on the internet, which is send a password unencrypted as plain text on the URL. So turns out that these form datas shouldn't be sent like so. Instead, they should be sent hidden. So we'll access this page, sending the data a different way so that it's slightly safer. And the way we do that is using a post request instead of a get request. So if we say method is post in the form, and then we go into our app UI and say methods, and then array, list posts, and this will say we're accepting only post requests on this endpoint. You can say this, get and post, and then we would accept both get and post, but we're only going to accept post because the form is only sending post messages right now. Okay, and then we'll go back here into our form and try again. Okay, so now it did something, but we're getting a none type error. It's not subscriptable. And that means that we've tried to access something as if it were a dictionary, but it was a none. And indeed, if we go into here, we can see that we're trying to find one from a database subscript collection, but it says none type is not subscriptable, which means database.database was null, or was none, in fact, for Python. So we haven't initialized a database, basically. That's what this is telling us. And indeed, we didn't. So we should do that. We should initialize a database. So let's initialize database. So we'll define a new method called initialize database. And what this will do is it'll say database dot import database initialize. So when do we call this initialize database? Well, we want to call it before we make a request to our application so that we have access to the database, right? Well, fortunately, Flask has something like this, which is this other decorator at app dot before first request. It will run this method before the first request. So basically, we'll log in, but before logging in, it's going to initialize the database. And then if we log in again, the database will already have been initialized, and we will not reinitialize it. Okay, let's restart the application and try one last time. Okay, the session isn't available because no secret key was set. So it turns out we have to set a secret key. And what is a secret key, you may ask? And really, a secret key is simply something that Flask uses to make sure that the data that we're sending the user in the form of a cookie, and we've briefly explained what that was in the when we looked at sessions, is secure. So we need to set a secure secret key here. So we do that with app.secretKey, and we can set it to wherever we want. So right now I'm not going to set it to a very secure one. However, if you are using this on the internet, you should set it to a secure one. Okay, let's try one last time and see what happens. Alright, so now we've logged in. Finally. So as you can see, this is the exact process that every programmer goes through when they are making their application. So nobody knows exactly what to do every time, but you read the feedback that the application gives you and you react to it. So we had a few problems along the way, but they were all solvable as long as you read it and try to understand it, try to understand the computer. It's trying to communicate with you. It turns out it doesn't do that very well most of the time, but it tries. And now we finally managed to log in. Okay, so what happens if we log in with a username that doesn't exist? Turns out we still get that. And why? Because the session already exists for this browser. So Google Chrome in my laptop already has the cookie that tells Flask that I'm logged in. So when I access this page, it sees that my username is wrong, but it doesn't do anything. So it still logs me in as the user that was already logged in before. So what we want to do is, if the user's login is not valid, then say session email is none. And of course we want to put this in an else, because if not, that will always happen, and we don't want that. So if the user's login is valid, log them in, and if not, set the session email to none. Okay, we'll have to restart the application, and then go into login again, and now I'm going to log in again as an incorrect user, and now it says hello none. So evidently that is not ideal, but we can now work around that. So that's a separate problem. What to do when the username is wrong, which would be to unset the email, redirect them to the login page, show them an error saying your email was wrong, try to log in again please. That would be what to do. Okay, so a long video describing an end-to-end deployment of functionality. We've changed the login form to ensure that it's sending data as a post, which is slightly safer. We've changed the login to ensure that it has the post, and we've added the login details to request.form gets data sent from the form. We've checked the user's login is valid, and then we've logged them in, which means setting the email in the session. And then we've ensured to unset that so we can't access somebody else's account, and if the username is wrong. And finally, we've rendered the profile.html template, passing it some data here, which is the email of the user. So a lot of things have happened in this video, and this is one of the first end-to-end deployments of functionality in this app. So hopefully you didn't find that too overwhelming. But of course, you are welcome to come along and ask questions, and I'll try to help you as best I can. But if everything was okay, then we are going to be moving on and allowing users to register. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be registering our users, and it's going to be a very similar procedure as what we did with the login. The first thing to do would be to create another route called something like register, and then give it the appropriate HTTP method, which is post. Remember, the get method would send parameters in the URL, and the post method sends them encoded and hidden from users, and then a register user method. And then we can get the email and password that they've written in the form, and I'm just going to copy the code from up here. And then we can simply register the user. If we go to the user model, we can see that register is a class method, and that only takes an email and a password. So the only thing we've got to do, and it also saves to MongoDB. So the only thing we've got to do really is say register user, and then give it the email and the password. Then we should probably also add the user's email to the session. And finally, we can return, we can return the same template as before. So in the register method, we'll get the email and password from the form, then we'll register the user, and then we'll add the email to the session, and finally we will render the template profile, just like we did with login. And I didn't actually realize that in the register method, or rather I forgot, we've actually already setting the session email to be email, so we don't have to do that here. Okay, there we go. Remember to constantly be checking your code to ensure that you're doing things that are correct as per your mental model of your program, because in many instances you'll be doing things that you think make sense, but you've actually forgotten or incorrectly constructed your mental model of what your program actually looks like. So in that case, I forgot that the email was in the session already from this method, and I wrote it there, but it wasn't necessary. So make sure you're constantly checking back and ensuring that what you're doing really makes sense. Okay, so now what we have to do is create the register profile. And also we will need an endpoint that will allow users to access the register template. So what I'm going to do is change these two endpoints. And I'm going to change them from /login to auth/login, and from /register to auth/register. That's simply for authentication. And now we can have other endpoints such as /login for the login template. and we can have /register for the register template. By the way, remember this is going to be now /login. This is going to be /register. So what the users are accessing really is your website and then the endpoint. In our case, it's 127.0.0.1:4995. But of course, if we put this in a server and give it an address, then this will change. Okay, so now we have to create the register template. So we're going to go into our templates and create a new HTML file and call it register. And it's actually going to be extremely similar to the login form. Before we proceed, remember to change the action here to be the correct action. Okay, copy everything and go into register.html. From auth login, change it to auth register. From login form, change it to register form or other ID. And then the rest is fine. Okay, so if we save that, we will actually realize from below that we've got an error. That's because these two are called the same. So instead of hello method, we want to change it to login template and register template. And now Python won't complain that we're doing something incorrect. Okay, so let's go back in here. Notice how now, if we remove login, we get a not found error because we no longer have an endpoint with nothing in it. All our endpoints have something, which means that there is no home page really. We should probably do something about that. So app route that def home template. And then we can return another template called home.html, which doesn't exist yet, but let's not worry about that. And then we can register our users here. So I'm going to register a new user called me, and the password is 123. And there we go. Now I am registered, and if I go into login, we can log in. And there we go. So now we see that the login and the registration works, and what we should do next is work on making them a bit prettier, really, so that our users aren't immediately bouncing off our site when they see our bare HTML forms. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. We're going to be implementing the Bootstrap framework onto our site. It's actually really easy, and it immediately makes everything substantially prettier. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to be getting started with Bootstrap. In order to get to this page, simply go to getbootstrap.com and then go into the Getting Started page. So I would recommend reading through this. It's very short and it explains how to get started with Bootstrap. So one of the things that we'll have to do is import the Bootstrap files into our HTML files. So Bootstrap, the only thing that Bootstrap is really is a CSS file and a JavaScript file. And they give our website some styling as well as some user interactivity. But really it's a bit more than that. Because with those CSS files and those JavaScript files, the flexibility and the power that they give us is very easy to use. So as you'll see once we get started with Bootstrap, you'll find that using Bootstrap is actually a matter of adding one attribute or two to the objects, our HTML objects. And that makes everything so fast and so easy to use. And yet, because they've worked on this for such a long time, and because of the way they've built it, using it is easy and the outcome is really nice. So this page is actually probably built using Bootstrap. And I'd be surprised if it wasn't. It would be slightly weird if the Bootstrap page was not built with Bootstrap, but nevertheless, it looks something like this anyway. So if we go into CSS, we see an explanation of how Bootstrap is built, and it's mobile first. That's one of the essentials. So what that means is it's meant to work, it's designed to work in mobile phones, and then it's designed to grow nicely into a desktop. the typography, the normalize, the containers and things like that. The grid system is very important in Bootstrap. And what a grid system is essentially Bootstrap is divided into 12 columns, and then you can very easily decide how wide your elements are. So if this page was divided into 12 columns, you could say one of them occupies 6 and the other one occupies 6, and then they would appear side by side. So very easy to use, and we will explain everything as we go along. And then move on to components at the top. And here you can see all of the different things that Bootstrap gives you. One such thing is the glyph icons, the small icons that you can put beside menu items and things like that. It looks very pretty. And then all the styling for drop downs and for button groups. You can do things like paging. You can do things like having different colored drop downs very easily. You've got input groups, which are essentially these things here that look really nice in your websites and give users an affordance as to what things are. So for example, if you've got this, your user immediately knows that they're meant to put the first part of their email here, although this should be the correct latter part of their email. When you've got things like this, that immediately tells the user that they're meant to put some sort of currency in there. So very usable and very nice. You've got navigation bars such as tabs or these called pills. So you've got a lot of things in Bootstrap, and we're going to be using the ones that we require. And of course, you should read through this and understand all the different parts, or at least have an idea that they exist, so that when you come to creating your own websites, you know whether something exists or not. Anyway, so enough of me babbling on about Bootstrap. If you go into the getting started and then you copy the first and the last links, and then you go into PyCharm and put them in your base.html, and you want to put your main CSS file after the Bootstrap one, because in CSS it's important that your file comes after the Bootstrap one. Okay, so that, and also the JavaScript one. Okay, so now we're using Bootstrap. It's really that simple, which means that we can begin using the different Bootstrap components. So if we go into our page and go into the login, you see that that's changed. Before, it didn't used to be like that. The fields were smaller, the button looked different, because Bootstrap has made it not Apple, not Chrome only. So it's made it a bit more standard, and we can make it better, of course. If we go into the login.html, here we can modify the form to be fully Bootstrap. So if we go into the Bootstrap page and then click on CSS, we can see that forms are here. And then it gives us a really nice example as to how the forms are implemented and how you can add your forms there. So individual form controls automatically receive global styling, which is what's happened to ours. Ours is only a form, and Bootstrap already sees that it's a form and then applies some global styling to it. All textual input, text area, and select elements with form control, notice the full stop before, are set to width 100% by default, and wrap labels and controls in dot form group for optimum spacing. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if we give this attribute to our input, text area, or select elements, then they will look like this. Their width would be 100% of their container. And then labels like this one will appear on top if they are in the form group class. So let's have a look at the form control class first. Simply go to your form and then find the input type like here. So here we can see they've got form, then they've got a div, and we're going to look at what that is in a moment, and then finally they've got their input type. And notice how the class is form control for all of them. That gives them some styling. So if we find our inputs, which are these two, and then type class equals form control. And then we go back into our site. Notice that now they've changed substantially. Now, I'm not saying this looks any better, because it probably doesn't, because it still needs some more work. But now that has Bootstrap features to it. They are 100% of the width. They don't have any margins. The submit button, however, still is not looking like Bootstrap. So in order to make it look like Bootstrap, we actually need to change it slightly. It doesn't have to be an input of type submit. It has to be a button of type submit with these classes here. So I'm just going to copy this code and then go here and change that. Now we go back to our site. Notice how that now looks a bit different. Okay, so why do theirs look like that and ours looks like terrible? That's because they've got these form groups. And a form group essentially is a label and an input type. So the label gives some description as to what the input should contain, and we should have that in our login form. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a div. And a div is essentially a piece of content that occupies all the space sideways. So essentially a div is a block that occupies a full space from side to side and not from top to bottom. So you cannot place multiple divs one beside each other normally. You can do with Bootstrap, but that is essentially what a div is. The counterpart to a div is called a span, and a span is an inline element, not a block element. So you can place multiple spans one beside another normally. So div class is going to be form group. And then we will cut that and put it after the input type. And then we're going to do that again for the other input type. Okay. And now if we go back to our site, it probably won't look any different. Now it has some spacing in between the fields, but that's it. And finally, we can add a label. So let's go back here and see how they've done it. And notice how, quite simply, they've got a label for and then the ID of the field. And that is the way you make a label. So label for email. And then here we would be, say, email. And then another one for the password. Sorry, I can't spell. And then we will say password. Okay, go back to our site. And now that's starting to look a bit better. However, it's very wide, and this is not a particularly usable thing. So what to do is now group this content in another div. And this div is going to ensure that our content is not occupying 100% of the screen width, but that it is occupying only a specific amount. And the way we're going to do that is actually with CSS. So container, that already makes it slightly better. This is a Bootstrap class. If we give it the class Bootstrap, it makes it slightly better, but it's not particularly ideal because it's still too wide. So as well as container, we can give it another class, which can be, for example, login page form. And then we can go into our main CSS and do something with this login page form. Notice how it has a full stop before the attribute to mean that this is, sorry, a class. If it has the hash symbol, it's because it's an ID. And then what we're going to tell it is max width is going to be 480 pixels. See if that's any better. Now that's substantially smaller, and that looks a bit better as well. Okay, so now we've got a login form here, which looks substantially better than what it did before we implemented Bootstrap. And we're still missing a lot of things on our page. We're missing things like having a navigation bar at the top, having a footer at the bottom, and possibly having some sort of background for this form. But that's something that we'll get to eventually in future sections. We're not going to worry too much about it just now. Okay, so this is how we would do this form. And we can do exactly the same for the registration form. So I'm going to copy and paste, remembering to change auth login for auth register. And that's really everything we have to change. Notice, however, that the login page form class is still here, even though this is the registered page. So we should probably change it to page form. Change that to page form and change your CSS file to page form as well. And now we've got the login looking like that and the register looking like exactly the same. So that's not very ideal. Another thing, we can change the submit button. We can change the login submit button to say login and the register button to say sign up. And now this says sign up and the login page will say login. Okay, so say we wanted to make the button green to ensure that people feel like clicking it. Simply go to the Bootstrap and then find the green button, which will be up here in the components. Actually, will it be in the components? It will be down here in buttons, sorry. And here are the different types of button that we can have. So button default is the one we've got. We can use primary, success, info, warning, or danger. So let's use green, so success. Notice how ours says btn space btn-default. So this is one class and this is another class. So this button type has two different classes. One of them is btn, the other one is btn-default. We're going to change btn-default for btn-success. And we are going to do that in both of our forms. And then when we go back, we can see that it is now green, and that's a lot better. So we can do a lot of things. We can move this button to the right, we can add the navigation bar, we can add a placeholder value on these fields, and there's a lot of things we can do, and I encourage you to play around with that. Try those things. Try to put a sample email and sample password as placeholders. Try to move the button to the right. Try to create a simple navigation bar that has your login and your registration pages. Do those things using Bootstrap, and you'll find that you'll quickly get acquainted with the way Bootstrap works and the sort of things you can do with it. So go ahead, play around with that, and then come back and we'll continue. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. So in this video we're going to be looking at how we can display a list of posts that a user has written. So below the register user endpoint, we're going to be creating another endpoint, which is going to be app.root and then something like blogs, and then at the end it's going to have a string which is going to be the user ID. So this root is going to be /blogs/ and then the very long user ID that is assigned when we create a user. And notice how now our method that appears below the root has a parameter user ID, which is this one here. Now we are going to display the blogs of a specific user. So the first thing we have to do is find that user. So we're going to do user.get by, sorry, not by email, get by ID, and then user ID. And then the blogs is user.get blogs. And then we're going to do return render template. It's going to be user blogs.html, where the blogs is going to be blogs. Okay, so what's happening here? We're going to find the user with this ID, then we're going to get that user's blogs, and finally we're going to render a template called user blogs that doesn't exist yet, and we're going to give that template a parameter, which is the blogs variable, and we're going to call that blogs. And now this template is going to be able to use these blogs to display a list of blogs. So let's go and make that template. right click on your templates and create a new HTML file and call it user_blogs. And now we can go into our profile, copy everything, paste it in user blogs, and instead of hello email, we're going to display a list of blogs. So the way we're going to do that is, first of all, let's go into a register and make sure that we copy this div up here. We don't need page form class, but we do need the container. And that container is going to, as you know, make sure that things are fitting in the screen properly as per the Bootstrap framework. And then in this container, we're going to have something like h2, a heading 2, and we're going to have a variable called email, and then '(s) blogs. So for example, my emails blogs, and we're going to need to pass the email of the user as a variable as well. Okay, and now we can say for each of the blogs in the blogs list, then render the blog. So the way we do that is for blog in blogs, end for, we're going to do something. And for each of the blogs, we want to say h3 blog.name, or title rather. And here, if you're using the PyCharm Professional Edition, you may get some proper Jinja to attributes and highlighting and things like that appearing. If you're using the Community Edition, then unfortunately you do not. And that's just one of the limitations of using the Community Edition. It's not a big deal though. If we go into our blog model, we can see that the attributes that we've got are author, title, author ID, description, and _ID. So that's the attributes we can use here. So title is one of them, the other one is description, and we can say p blog.description, and of course I did forget to do this here. Okay, so h3 is a heading that is smaller than h2, and h2 is smaller than h1. So h1 is the biggest heading, h5 or h6, I don't really know. One of those two is the smallest heading. P stands for paragraph, and it's just a normal paragraph with some space at the top, some margin at the top, that's all. Okay, so now for each of the blogs, we're displaying the title and then the description. And then I'm also going to display HR. HR is a horizontal rule. It's just a line, basically, that will separate one blog from another. Okay, so that's brilliant. Now we've got a way to display the blogs. So the only problem that I see with that is that we need a string user ID. So we need to get to the blogs page by knowing the user ID of somebody. And the user ID is normally quite complex. So we're going to do something as well. App root just /blogs. And user ID is going to be none by default. So if we access this root, then user ID will be none. If we access this root with a user ID, then that value will replace the user ID's value. And then what we'll say is, if user ID is not none, we'll do that. Else, user is user find by get by email rather, session email. Okay, so I think you can see what I'm doing here. If the user ID is not none, it means we've accessed this root, we've given it a user ID, so we want to find that user's blogs. If we access this one, it means we want to access our own blogs, so we're getting the user as per the session email, i.e. yourself, if you're logged in. If you access this and you're not logged in, you're going to get a nasty error. So hopefully nobody does that, and that can be something that you guys can work on your own time if you want to add verification to ensure that session email is set. But let's not worry about that just now. and we will implement that at a later date. Okay, so this will show our blogs as per our email or somebody's user ID. So the first thing to do, of course, is to have some data in there, because if I restart this and then I go over to Chrome when I log in, that's me. But if we go to blogs, we can see that nothing shows up. So we've got this, which is good, but there are no blogs simply because I haven't written any. So what to do is go into the terminal and put some sample blogs and see if that works. So this is simply for verification purposes. Okay, so db.blogs.find. Notice that this blog here is now of an old format. db.users.find. So now we've got my user here, and this is the ID of the user. So what I'm going to do is then say db.blogs.insert, and that is the blog that I copied from before. And remember that the blogs now have another property, which is author_ID, which is going to be my ID. So I'm going to write that in. And of course, sorry about that, that has a duplicate ID because I didn't change the _ID of it. I'm going to change that just now. Just going to increase it by 1, not something you should do in a production server, something that is live to your users, but we can do it here for testing purposes. Okay, so now we've inserted 1 row, and if we refresh here, we can now see that we've got our first blog here. And you can even see the small faint line at the bottom separating our blogs. Okay, so that's how we would display a list of blogs. And of course, trust me, if we added more blogs, which I'll do just now for you, if we add more blogs, they will also show up there. And navigating through this with a terminal always takes some time, but I will do it just for you. And we will refresh, and now we've got that and the description there. So this is how we would display a short list of blogs. Now what to do is to be able to click them and then access a list of posts in that blog. And we're going to work on that in the next video. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. So this is getting exciting now. We've started to get something that actually it looks like something. So this is when it gets the most fun. So we want to be able to click on one of these and access the posts for that blog. So evidently, when we are accessing the blogs of the posts of one blog, we want to access them. So just in the same way as we need the user ID in order to be able to access the blogs of a specific user, we need the blog ID to access the posts of a specific blog. So let's create another route here. I keep switching between the American and English pronunciations of that, and I'm really sorry. I am not a native, so as you know. So I'm going to create another route here called posts/string blog ID. And in this case, it doesn't really make sense to have one without the blog ID because posts are never going to be without a blog. So you may access your own blogs, in which case you don't want to put your own user ID there, but you're never going to access a separate post from a blog. So all posts have a blog ID associated with them. Okay, and then we'll define blog posts, and then blog ID is the parameter. And what we'll do is we'll find the blog with that ID, and then we'll say from Mongo blog ID. And then we will say posts equal blog dot get posts down here. We'll need to import blog as well. Okay, so now we've got the posts, and if we go to our post model here, we can see what sort of info the post has: a blog ID, a title, content, author, created date, and an ID. Okay, so if we go to the blog, oh, sorry, something happened there. I think my laptop went a bit mental. We can see that the get posts calls the post.fromBlog method, and then the post from blog simply finds the posts with that blog ID. So that's exactly what we want. And then what we'll do is simply return render template, say posts.html, where the posts is that list of posts that we just found. And we will also need a blog name equal to blog.title. And I'll change that to blog title. So now we're going to show a page that shows the blog title at the top and then a list of posts below it. So we'll create that template now. Let's go and create a new HTML file called posts.html, copy everything from user blogs, paste it there, and now instead of emails blogs, we simply want to show blog title up there in H2, and instead of for blog in blogs, we want to say for post in posts. That would make sense. Remember, you can call this variable whatever you want. And we'll say post.title and post.content. So if we go to our post model again, we'll see that title and content are the correct variables. And at the very bottom, I'm actually going to put another P called post.author, just so we know who the author is. Okay, so let's do that. And of course, in order to be able to do this, we need some sample data in the database. So the first thing to do is to check that the website actually works by going into the posts. And we don't have an ID, so we can't actually check until we do have an ID in there. So we have a few posts here, and all of them are using object ID, as you can see, which means they are old posts. So we're going to remove them all, and instead we're going to insert our own. So the underscore ID is going to be 123, doesn't matter, that's just a sample. And then going back to PyCharm, need to find exactly what the post is made of. It is a blog ID. So blog underscore ID is going to be one of my blogs. So say, for example, this one up here. The title is going to be sample post. The content is going to be lorem ipsum. And if you don't know what lorem ipsum is, you can Google that. And created date is going to be one of these ISO dates here that I'm going to copy. And I think that's it. There's probably author missing as well. Blog ID, title, content, created date has to have quotation marks around it. And the author is missing as well. So author is going to be Jose. Okay, so we've inserted one, so we can go back into Chrome, refresh this, and of course we can't click on it just yet. We haven't added that functionality in, so I'm going to go into the terminal, find the ID of the post, and go to posts/123, and then we've got a small error here. So we have to find out exactly what the problem is. And indeed, the blog from Mongo, so this ID here should actually be the blog ID and not the post ID. So sorry about that. And there we have our blog title and the first post, the content, and the author here. Okay, so how would we click on it and access the link? Well, that's actually fairly simple. If we go into the user blogs.html, we've got our H3, which is the title. That's this. And then what we want to do is ensure that we can click on it and go somewhere. So in order to click something, we use another HTML element, which is A, which stands for anchor. And that's the way it goes. So A, href, and then closing tag at the end. Remember to put the closing tags appropriately, enclosed by the h3. And the href here has to be /posts /blog._id. So let's refresh that, and now notice how they've turned blue, and clicking it actually takes us to the right place. Clicking this one takes us to something that has no content. Alright, so that's how you would display the list of posts, and now we're going to work on being able to click this and show that there are no posts, but we're going to do that in the very next video. So I'll see you there.